Let me start our message and our thoughts today by asking you to think about a question. What is the fastest way to ruin your life? Well, it's a good thing it wasn't an emotionally heavy question, but anyway, what is the fastest way, maybe not the most complete, but the fastest way to ruin your life? Now, I bet if I took a poll and I asked different people to act like in a Bible class to answer that question, we'd probably get slightly different verbiage between different people in terms of describing that, but I bet if we distilled all the averages, it would come down to the fact that the fastest way to ruin your life is some sort of major moral failure. Some sort of major failure of integrity would probably be the fastest way to make things completely fall apart for anybody. And you don't have to read very much news. You don't have to be even much of a news junkie to realize that that's something that happens in our world on a fairly regular basis. At any given point in any particular month of news, I could pretty much point to somebody somewhere who has completely ruined their public life, and oftentimes their private life as well, by something that they did that they had no business being involved in. And quite frankly, everybody realizes that that is just a total sacrifice of their integrity. Whether it's a public figure that's been revealed to be involved in some sort of scandal like a sexual affair or a money laundering type of situation, or some sort of connection with a different country that they shouldn't be connected with. We saw that happen to a senator not too many weeks ago. All sorts of things like that are some sort of catastrophic failure of integrity that can completely ruin the public and private life of just about anybody that you're talking to. However, what about the people that you don't hear that sort of thing about? Why is it that there's no news about people who just live a good life of integrity? Well, the reason is because it's not exciting. Okay, that's why there's no news about it. But there are a handful of stories about that, and especially throughout the Bible, you do find a handful of stories about people who, by and large, live a good life of integrity. And it's not noteworthy in the sense of something, right in your face and something that deserves urgent attention. But when you look back over it, wouldn't you rather know more of those stories than the scandals? So what I want to do today is I want to point you to one of those in the Old Testament. This is a Bible story that's probably not quite as familiar to a lot of us, but we're going to start in 2 Chronicles 22. So if you've got a Bible and you can be opening to that, you can pretty much just camp there for the rest of the time today. 2 Chronicles 22 and 23. And we're going to look at the story of a guy who does live with integrity, but he is contrasted strongly with a bunch of other scandals. Okay, so I'm just going to tell you here on the front end before I even start running down the story, this is not a feel-good story. There's one feel-good character in it, and I'll end with him today. But there's really no feel-good characters in the rest of this, okay? And it won't leave you with any just warm, fuzzy feelings by the time we get to the end of this with a whole lot of hope for God's people, It's not that kind of a story. This is a depressing and a tragic story, but it shows us the power of the integrity factor in the life of the one good man who shines like a light out of darkness through the entire thing. So, here's what happened. Here's the story as we're tracing it. The story starts with a jolt in verse 10 of 2 Chronicles 22. And the jolt is that the king of God's treasured people, his precious possession, the king has died, and rather than simply letting one of that king's sons be crowned the next king, his mother, the queen mother, decides she's going to wipe out every possible heir to the throne and claim it for herself. So there's mass death at the beginning of the story, as all of her grandsons who could have a claim to the throne are being killed. And again, instead of letting things just take the natural course, she becomes this bloodthirsty, power-hungry tyrant who makes herself out to be queen. And so this first section of the story describes the queen's violence. And I hope you can sort of put yourself in the headspace and in the event as it's happening right here as you scan through those verses. I hope that you can imagine how broken her mind must be by sin, that instead of mourning and crying out to God and just letting His chosen one take the throne next, that she decides to take this for herself. And then I hope you can imagine the mourning that must be taking place and the tears that are being cried as all of this evil is being perpetrated. That everybody who hears about all these sons of the king is going to be completely heartbroken. No matter how connected or not connected they were specifically to the royal house, they're going to be heartbroken to hear of the deaths of all of these. Jerusalem becomes a bloodbath. And for those who knew the royal family, they must have been beyond terrified. And yet, out of those people and out of that royal family, even as terrified as they must be, there is one woman among the group who does something truly wonderful. A daughter of the former king, the one who has just died, saves the only heir to the throne. She saves one of his sons who is only a year old. She and her husband, a priest in God's temple, and the priest is named Jehoiada. You need to keep that name in your mind, Jehoiada, that's the priest. But she and her husband, that priest, they save this little kid, they protect him in the temple where they can raise him and make sure that there is one surviving heir to David's throne over God's people. Again, he's only about a year old, okay? And so at this moment, the entirety of David's throne and God's whole plan that will bring about the king who will sit on the throne of David, it's hanging by a thread. This one kid, 1 year old, is the only heir to the throne. And so this woman's kindness really helps to drive this story forward. Now, when we get to chapter 23, some years have passed. The kid is still in the care of Jehoiada the priest and his good wife who saved his life. But now some years have passed and he's 7 years old. And this is where our man that we want to focus on today, Jehoiada, this is where he really comes forward as the hero. In verses 1 through 10, it says, he took courage and he sets up a very thorough plan to make sure that the king is well protected from his murderous grandma. Like that sentence should ever have to be said in the world, but it's what happened, okay? And then in verse 11, it says, they brought out the king's son and they put the crown on him and they gave him the testimony and they proclaimed him king, and Jehoiada and his sons anointed him and they said, long live the king. In spite of who's in control of the country, Jehoiada brings out the only rightful king and crowns him king. And he must have known what potential there was for problems in doing that, because the problems are going to start to unfold very quickly after that. But he must have known what he was risking by doing this, and yet he knew it was the right thing to do. And he did it. And David's throne, David's lineage was saved as a result. Now, it probably doesn't come as too much of a shock that when murderous grandma finds out about this, she's upset. And that is the understatement of the morning, to say that she is upset. She is raging, is what's happening here. And so starting in verse 12, this is the story of how all that goes down. When she heard the noise of the people running and cheering the king, she went to them at the temple of the Lord. She looked, and there was the king standing by his pillar at the entrance of that temple of the Lord. The officers and the trumpeters were beside the king, and all the people of the land were rejoicing and blowing trumpets, and musicians with their instruments were leading the praises. And then she tore her robes and shouted, treason, treason. But Jehoiada the priest sent out the commanders of units of 100 who were in charge of the troops, and he said to them, bring her out between the ranks and put to the sword anyone who follows her. For the priest had said, do not put her to death at the temple of the Lord. And so they seized her as she reached the entrance of the gate of the palace grounds, and there they put her to death. Murderous grandma is done. And the end of her story is a welcome addition to this bigger and grander story. And so what a relief, right? For a minute here, we get this really wonderful moment where everything seems to be going well. And in fact, the last verse of this chapter says that it was a relief to all the people who lived in Israel or lived in Jerusalem that Athaliah, the murderous queen mother, had been put to the sword. Now, the next several things that happen in chapter 24 are all important as well. Jehoiada the priest, the man who set all of this in motion, from the time that they put the murderous queen mother to death, from that time forward, he sets this great revival in motion. Okay, so throughout Israel, they do some amazing things. They renew their covenant with God. They're doing restoration work on the temple of God. They are tearing down a temple to Baal so that God will not be worshipped anymore by the people who are supposed to only be worshiping God. And everything is being reinstated and put back in place. And Jehoiada and the king are working together to make this happen. Everything is turning around and it's really going so well. And so the last verse of the chapter, all the people of the land rejoiced and the city was calm because Athaliah had been slain by the sword, and all is well. And I wish the story ended right there, but it doesn't. Because I wish that it ended with our hero Jehoiada having installed the king and everybody lived happily ever after, and it was all just faithfulness to God for the rest of the story. But there's more to come. And so in chapter 24, the boy king grows up, and sure enough, as he grows up, Jehoiada stands beside him and guides him in the ways of the Lord, and he leads the people in godly ways for many years. In fact, chapter 24, verse 2 says he leads the people in the ways of God all the years of Jehoiada, that priest. And so this is the story then of a priest's integrity. This is the integrity factor that we're talking about here. This man, he and the new king spend a large part of chapter 24 doing all of that revival work that I'm talking about. And this boy king has grown up now and is genuinely doing some great things in the service to his God because Jehoiada stands beside him. But then here's the rest of the story that we need to think about today, starting at the end of verse 14. As long as Jehoiada lived, burnt offerings were presented continually in the temple of the Lord. Now Jehoiada was old and full of years, and he died at an age of 130. He was even buried with the kings in the city of David because of the good that he had done for Israel and for God and for his temple. But, verse 17, after the death of Jehoiada, the officials of Judah came and paid homage to the king, and he listened to them. They abandoned the temple of the Lord, the God of their ancestors, and they worshipped Asherah poles and idols. Because of their guilt, God's anger came on Judah and Jerusalem, although the Lord sent prophets to the people to bring them back to Him, and though they testified against them, they would not listen. So this is where the happy endings start to turn south. This is where the good parts of this story start to turn to dust in our hands. Because this is where the story starts telling us about a king's arrogance. And this gets really, really bad. Because not only have the king and his people forgotten God, not only have the king and his people immediately turned away from the God of Jehoiada and started worshiping idols, and not only have they refused to listen to the prophets that God is sending them, but they're doing all of this right after the death of Jehoiada, this good priest who led them to worship God. They're doing this after the death of a man who saved the life of the king, who put him on the throne over God's people, who spent years restoring the temple and being properly faithful to Yahweh, and in short order they have unraveled all of that good man's life work. And then here's the final straw. As the prophets come to the king and the king won't listen to them, God ups the ante and He sends one final prophet to try to change the king's mind. And this final prophet is the very son of Jehoiada. And so start reading again in verse 20. Then the Spirit of God came upon the son of Jehoiada the priest. He stood before the people and he said, "This is what God says. Why do you disobey the Lord's commands? You will not prosper. Because you have forsaken the Lord, He has forsaken you." But they plotted against him, and by order of the king, they stoned him to death in the courtyard of Yahweh's temple. King Joash did not remember the kindness Jehoiada had shown him, but killed his son, who, as he lay dying, said, "May the Lord see this and call you to account." The story of a prophet's murder is so wrong on so many levels. Now, there's a small but important detail to this story that shows up later in the New Testament. You remember that one passage where Jesus is criticizing the scribes and the Pharisees of his day, and he says, "You've killed every prophet that God ever sent to you, from Abel to Zechariah." Well, that works out well in English because it's literally from A to Z, Abel and Zechariah. What's interesting about it, though, is it works out really well in Hebrew as well, because in the Hebrew Bible, 2 Chronicles is the last book in the Old Testament. And Abel is the first one who is martyred for his faith. Zechariah is chronologically, in the Old Testament, the last one who is martyred for speaking the truth of faithfulness to God. And so when Jesus says, "You have killed and rejected every prophet sent through all your generations," it was literally from Genesis 4 to the end of the Old Testament. And so this is the final ending of the story of a good man. That yes, Jehoiada did good, and yes, King Joash, while Jehoiada was standing by his side, he also did good. But when it came to a true test of his faithfulness, and somebody said, "You're in the wrong, king," he kills the son of the good man who saved his life, raised him, taught him his faith, and had done so much good for his people. And it's one of those moments where I think it's important for us to kind of stop and appreciate the fact that this is not a small moral failure on the part of the king and his people. Like, you can't call this a lapse in judgment. You can't call this a moral stumble or a mistake of any kind. This is all out evil done to this prophet Zechariah. Not only is he refusing to listen to the word of God, not only is he refusing, or rather is he killing a prophet who speaks for God, not only is he killing him in the temple where there should never be bloodshed by an innocent person, not only is he killing this man who is his own cousin, which if you go back and read through the story, you realize the king and Zechariah are cousins, first cousins, but by killing the son of Jehoiada, the king has completely turned his back on all the kindness that he's been shown through this man's life, through all of the interactions that came before this. And so because of the king's foolishness, because of his evil, as you might imagine, with such a heartless crime being committed, things get worse before they get better. And so the rest of the chapter tells us how God gave Israel into the hand of their enemies in a battle that came up just a handful of months later. And the king died after being assassinated by two of his own servants. He was wounded in battle, they took him back to recover, and two of his servants came and killed him in a hospital bed. And so the last story, or the last verse that tells about him, is 2 Chronicles 24, verse 25. So the king died, and he was buried in the city of David, but not in the tombs of the kings. That's quite a statement, isn't it? The king died, but he's not honored as a king in his death. In fact, the only thing that is left behind for him is a fool's legacy. He was buried in the city of David, but not with the honor of a king. And so that's how the bloody story of a raging and murderous queen, a priest who was a good man, and a king whose base ingratitude brought about one of the most tragic and bloody stories in the Old Testament, that's how it wraps up. I chose to talk about this story because I thought it was an interesting addition to Josh's series that he's been doing on Living Like Kings. That up and downs happen all the way through so many of those stories of the kings of God's people. And this one, I think, kind of pulls the heights of the ups and the depths of the lows all together right here. That here's a good man, quite literally, look at that list, quite literally in the middle of everything that's happening. He is the only good person. And yet, look how badly his people fail around him. So what do you do with all of that? Like, what are we to make of the events that happen in these kind of 2.5 chapters of 2 Chronicles? I know that lessons like this can be on display in some really rich and pretty obvious ways, but let me take a few minutes of your time this morning just to put a fine point on 3 lessons you can learn from 3 of the different characters that are part of this whole unfolding event, okay? First, A lesson from the boy king who grew up to forsake his teacher and forsake his God, and that is this lesson: make your faith your own. Make your faith your own. Okay? This is one of those lessons that normally the young people get this lesson, and you should, okay? Because it's important as like a developmental milestone in your life. That at some point, yes, people have given you teaching along the way. They have given you a sense of the importance of the faith. But at some point, you have to take ownership of that and make it truly a part of who you are. That you truly believe these things and you commit your life to God. That it's not anymore just because so-and-so told me that this was right, or because my church always said this was right, or because, I don't want to disappoint so-and-so by doing this. It's not always just that. It's a matter of the fact that I believe in God, I know what His Word says, and that matters to me more than anything else. You got to make that part of who you are. And again, I know that's a lesson for young people, but let's be honest, if we're past the point where anybody can call us young, we still need to learn this lesson. This is still crucially important. And we can see it so obviously from this king, because he did some great things in service to God. He led the restoration of the temple. He gave the people an opportunity to turn their hearts toward God. And I have no doubt that all those people watching him looked at him and said, that is a man whose faith is strong and real. But the text is pretty open about the fact that that faith wasn't his. Whose was it? It was Jehoiada's. And so all the days that Jehoiada stood by his side, he was faithful to God. But when it came time for him to stand on his own 2 feet in the faith, he was nowhere. And so that's what we need. We need to make sure that we learn from this to make our faith personal, to make it a part of who we are, to make sure that we have an anchor that is behind the veil, as we talked about in our class this morning, that we own the fact that we are God's children. And then right along with that lesson, let's please remember the instruction from Hebrews 13 and verse 7 where it says, remember your leaders who spoke the word of God to you. Consider the outcome of their way of life and imitate their faith. Listen, I want you to make your faith your own, but I also want you to keep in mind that kind of background knowledge that if I walk away from this and if I commit some sort of moral failure, there are going to be people who are going to be sorely disappointed in me. And that matters. That's part of the church community that we're supposed to be as God's people, is that there's a depth to that kind of relationship where I don't want to disappoint them. I don't want to make them mourn for my lost faith. And so I know there's kind of a natural sense, like of course you should show respect for the people who teach you the things of God, but the king in this story didn't do it. And it just kind of sets our teeth on edge to see how badly he betrayed the legacy of his mentor. And so that's why it's good advice for us to follow, because we really should remember the people who will be disappointed in us if we walk away from our faith. We should think about what it means to throw away the influence of parents and Bible class teachers and elders and ministers who have given us good guidance in seeking God. Is that the entirety of why you believe? It better not be. But it is at least a factor in it. It's something that we should take as a lesson here, that you own your own faith and you make it your own, and you do that in a way that honors those who have taught you and led you and guided you. Now, the second lesson here, I think, is one that we ought to learn from Jehoiada's wife, who saved this king as a baby, and that is, be willing to take a risk in order to do the right thing. Be willing to take a risk in order to do the right thing. Jehoiada's wife only gets mentioned in 2 verses in the whole of the Bible, and both of them tell exactly the same thing. One is from Chronicles and the other is from Kings, and they're both telling about this one thing that she did. This is the only event in the entirety of her life that we know about. But it is no small act in the grand scheme of the Bible. Her name is Jehosheba. I didn't mention her name earlier, but there it is. You've got it now. Her name is Jehosheba. She is intensely connected in this story. So she's the sister of the king who died first at the beginning of the story. She's the wife of the good priest who does all this good stuff throughout the story. She's the aunt of the boy king who totally fell apart by the end of the story. And so she's deeply connected in all of this. And she's so deeply connected, in fact, that if you think about it, the story falls apart without her. She gets exactly one line in the way the story is told, but the whole thing falls apart without her. As I said a little while ago, the throne of David, the lineage of King David, is hanging by a thread at this point. And this is the woman who makes sure that that thread doesn't get cut. Just by saving the life of this kid, the lineage of David as the kings of God's people is preserved so that eventually we get to Jesus, the king who sits on the throne of David today. The plan of God, brothers and sisters, hinged on this lady's one very risky choice to do the right thing and save this kid. What would have happened to her if she'd been discovered in what she was doing? Who knows, but it wouldn't have been good. And so the question is, are we willing to take a risk to do the right thing in the way that she was willing to take a risk to do the right thing? What if speaking the truth in a college class means that the professor will fail us in the course? Is that a risk that we're willing to take? What if doing the right thing toward family members risks them never speaking to us again? Is that a risk that we're willing to take? What if doing the right thing at work risks missing out on a promotion and being relegated to the jobs that nobody wants? Is that a risk that we're willing to take? I think if we put this lady in any of those situations, she would have been very quick to take the risk and do what was right. And I hope that we can learn from her to do the same thing. And that leads us to the final thing that we need to learn about godly living from this story, and that comes from our hero of the day, from Jehoiada himself. And the lesson is, do the right thing always. Live a life of integrity. Now, maybe you're thinking, really, Dan, you took us deep into this Old Testament obscure story to tell us that we should obey God and live a good life. And my answer is yes, that's exactly what I did, and I did it on purpose. Because this lesson is so powerful in Jehoiada's life. He is to the story in his time what Hector is to the Iliad. Anybody ever read the Iliad? There is one, and exactly one, good person in that story. It's Hector all the way through. Everybody else is a mess. And Jehoiada is the Hector of this story. Of all the key players in the great drama that unfolds throughout here, only Jehoiada serves God faithfully from beginning to end. Is he perfect? No. He actually does have a couple of moral failures throughout. There's one time where the king comes to him and says, hey, Jehoiada, we agreed on this. You're supposed to be doing this thing to restore the house of God. How come you're not doing it? And Jehoiada has to repent and say, okay, you know what? Let's change that. But there's no great scandal in his life. And so he shines like a lighthouse on a dark shore in this story, in such an impressive way, drawing us to see the honor and the glory of God. And again, I know that that's one of those things that is not newsworthy, as I said at the beginning. That this is not newsworthy, but it's so impressive in his life for a handful of reasons. The first is that Jehoiada is a priest to God. And in the history of God's people, the priests have especially not been defined by the holiness that they should have been. Go back and start just kind of isolating different priests throughout the Old Testament story, and you will not see the glowing examples of moral perfection that you would hope from them. But you do find one here. You do find that in the life of Jehoiada. And you find a man who is the one making provisions to protect and install the rightful king over God's people. He wants to see God's will done for these people. And so he makes sure that that happens. And then Jehoiada is the one who leads the revival in Israel. And I know it's short-lived, but it's there. He's the man who starts all of this happening as people turn their hearts and their practices back toward God. And then the Holy Spirit makes it clear that the king's righteousness, the righteousness of the throne, is on his shoulders. Everything depends on him, and he's good enough that it actually happens. He has enough integrity that that actually works throughout the entirety of his life. And then this is my favorite detail of the entire thing, is that when Jehoiada, the high priest, died, where was he buried? He was buried, brothers and sisters, in the tomb of a king. And then the kid who followed him, the king that was actually the king, when he died, where was he buried? Not with those kings. That to me says that among a group of people who are morally bankrupt, they still know a good man when they see one. And that is the power of the integrity factor. That among a group of people who are worshiping idols, who are practicing all sorts of things that are evil and that are against the commands of their God, among a group of people who are morally bankrupt, they know a good man when they see him. And that's the factor, that's the integrity factor that I hope we can that's the power of the integrity factor that I hope we can learn from in the way that we live. When I've been asked to speak at funerals, there is nothing harder than trying to honor somebody who wasn't honorable. And I've had to do that a couple of times where somebody just, made a phone call to the preacher who was like the closest one on the street to the funeral home, and that happened to be me. And they said, "Hey, would you come and do this funeral service for this family? They don't know, they don't know a preacher or whatever." And so I would sit down with the family and I would ask them, "Okay, what nice things, because it's a funeral, you should say nice things. What nice things do you want me to say about your loved one who has passed away?" And they just sit there for a minute and twiddle their thumbs and they go, "Well, I don't know, why don't you read a poem or something?" Listen, when integrity is not there, when there's been some sort of either single moral failure that has colored the whole way people look at your life, or when it's been a regular occurrence of things that should not have been part of who you are, those sorts of legacies continue to last. But on the flip side of that coin, I have had times where I've sat down with a family member that I was asked to do the funeral for their loved one, and I said, "What would you like me to say about them?" And they wouldn't stop talking about all the good things about that person. And they will be open about the fact that, "Listen, Mama, Daddy, they were not perfect, but I can't say enough good things about who they were anyway. I don't want to talk about their imperfections because they were so vastly overshadowed by a life of integrity and kindness and peace and joy and godliness." And that's what I want. I want to make sure that I'm living right now in a way that people will describe my life as being a major example of the integrity factor. That right now, my actions are known by everybody as a good person, That if they knew everything about me, they would still think of me the same way. That's what I'm hoping for. I'm hoping that we're living in a way that we're not afraid to get caught in anything because there's nothing to be caught in. I'm hoping that we're living in a way that even God, who already knows who we are, would describe us the way He described Job, that is a man who is blameless and upright and walks in my ways. I'm hoping that I'm living like that every single day. And so let me just ask you a handful of questions that you can use to test yourself to see if you're living like Jehoiada. Are your bank account and your investments going to tell a story of integrity about you? Would your coworkers tell a story of integrity about you? What about your kids? What about your browsing history and your Snapchat and your text threads? Are they going to tell a story of integrity about you? Do your grades and your papers and your tests, do they tell a story of integrity about you? What about your neighbors, your business partners, your non-Christian friends? Would they be able to describe you as a person that even if they're morally bankrupt, they see you as a good person, and they know a good person when they see one? And if that's not who you are, if your answer to any of those questions is, I don't think so, then here's my follow-up question. When are you going to change it? And the answer should be now. Because look at the life and how well God is glorified by the life of somebody who lives with integrity among a group of people who were vastly out of sync with the way they should have been living for God. The way that Jehoiada's story is told, you don't see a lot of mention of things beyond his lifetime. The Holy Spirit doesn't talk about what happens to him in eternity, but we know enough about faithfulness, I think, from his story and the rest of the Bible to assume that the man is with his God now and is waiting for the consummation of the ages. And I'm rather looking forward to meeting him after having seen his story here. But more than that, I hope that the same thing will be said about me. That the integrity factor of my life is going to lead to a point where it's easy to assume that I will be with my God waiting for the consummation of the ages. And I hope the same for you. I hope the same for you, that if you have been faithful to Jesus, to the one who sits on the throne of David today, that if you've been faithful in your service to Him, that it will be easy to assume about you that that's where you are too. So if you're a believer who's not living like you should right now, this needs to be the time when you change it. And so if you want people to pray with you and pray for you about that, if you want to talk to me about that, or I'm going to presume on the elders of this church, if you want to talk to any of them about that, then this is a good opportunity to make that known publicly and ask for that. But maybe it's just something that you need to fix between you and God in the quiet of your own heart. And this is a good opportunity for that too. To repent, confess what you've done, change it before Him, and commit yourself again to faithfully serving Him. And if that's something that you want to do, make sure that you don't put off this opportunity to do that either. Because in any case, I hope that what sticks with us today is the power of that integrity factor. That even if it just starts right now, the rest of your life can be defined by that the same way that Jehoiada's was. I hope that you're impressed by the life of this good man, and I hope that just by knowing his story, we're drawn closer to having the kind of story we ought to have as we do our best to live in service to God. If we can help you in some way and you want to make that known publicly, why don't you come talk to me while we stand and sing this hymn together?